The Wars of the Roses were a period in which the influence of powerful women was unmistakable. Figures like Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville exemplify this, as women played key roles as political actors, shaping the course of the conflict. Often, they are seen in opposition to one another. However, one rivalry in particular receives too little attention. Even Philippa Gregory, in her fictional portrayals, only briefly addresses it, failing to give it the recognition it deserves. This rivalry between Cecily Neville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg was a significant factor in fueling the Wars of the Roses. Though both women were technically on the same side, their divergent visions of how they and their children should navigate the era's challenges helped accelerate the conflict. After all, their children were none other than King Edward IV and his queen, Elizabeth Woodville. At the time, the role of a queen mother was a relatively new concept. Kings typically married foreign brides, whose mothers rarely accompanied them to England. As a result, the king's mother had no rival and could assume her traditional roles unchallenged. These included serving as a symbolic embodiment of dynastic continuity at court, acting as an informal mediator for her son, engaging in charitable work, and exemplifying religious virtue. She might also personally forge powerful alliances through remarriage. Crucially, she played a significant role in overseeing the education of the heir to the throne. The extent of her political activity depended on her own ambitions and the desires of her son, but her influence was substantial. It was widely accepted that a king's mother would offer him advice and support. With the arrival of Jacquetta of Luxembourg, however, a new and unexpected figure emerged to challenge this traditional role. Jacquetta saw her duties quite differently from Cecily Neville, creating a rivalry that never saw a resolution. Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York later succeeded in something that eluded Cecily and Jacquetta, integrating the Queen into the dynasty. In contrast, Henry VII was forced to remove Elizabeth Woodville, his mother-in-law, from court to end a similar competition. No such resolution occurred with Jacquetta, leading to a fatal division. But first, some context is necessary. Cecily and Jacquetta were rivals from the outset, primarily due to their differing positions at court. Jacquetta, the daughter of Count Peter of Luxembourg St. Pol, had first married John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford. As a result, Jacquetta briefly held the prestigious title of Queen in Waiting, and retained the title of Duchess of Bedford, even after her first husband's death. As the second highest-ranking lady at court, Jacquetta's position was surpassed only by Queen Margaret of Anjou. Even Catherine of Valois, the mother of the reigning king, was ranked below her. This held true even though Jacquetta's second marriage, to the knight Sir Richard Woodville, was considered a scandalous step down in status. But that's a story for later. Cecily, who came after Jacquetta in rank, deeply resented this. Through her mother, Joan Beaufort, she descended directly from Edward III via the Lancaster line. Her father, Ralph Neville, served as Earl Marshal in Henry IV's court, and in 1422 he was entrusted with the guardianship of Richard of York. Cecily had been betrothed to Richard in childhood, and they married in 1429. Like Cecily, Richard could trace his lineage back to Edward III, making them a formidable couple. Cecily was also closely connected to the influential Percy family. Among all English women, Cecily held the highest rank and was keenly aware of it. She willingly submitted to her friend, Margaret of Anjou, but grudgingly accepted Jacquetta's position. In 1460, her patience seemed to pay off. The Act of Accord named her husband the heir to the throne, elevating Cecily to the status of Queen in Waiting. Her rank officially surpassed that of Jacquetta. In fact, Cecily had already held this position before the birth of Henry VI's son, as her husband had been Henry's heir. Upon Richard's death and the coronation of her son Edward IV, Cecily became Queen Dowager. For a few years during Edward's reign before he married, Cecily was the highest-ranking woman in England, and Edward made full use of her political acumen, involving her in his government. Cecily played the role of Queen Dowager flawlessly. Cecily was also closely aligned with her nephew, Richard Neville, the Kingmaker. The two were in frequent contact, and Cecily lobbied for Neville's support of Edward while praising him to her son in return. It was clear to Cecily that Edward needed to marry, and she envisioned a conventional royal marriage with a foreign princess, someone of a higher rank than herself, but who would still allow Cecily to remain central in Edward's life due to her extensive networks, noble lineage, and experience. Her vision was that she and Neville would guide Edward politically, while his wife would focus on producing heirs. However, things took an unexpected turn. Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, bringing not just a commoner, though this is misleading, given Elizabeth's mother's status, but also Jacquetta back to the court. Cecily suddenly found herself ranked below a woman she deemed unworthy and in direct competition with a former queen-in-waiting whom she despised. This rivalry was fueled by their starkly different upbringings and political cultures. Henry VI had already fallen victim to these cultural clashes, and Cecily now feared that Edward might suffer the same fate. Women from the continent had a different understanding of how freely they could act in the political sphere. Female sovereign rule was known and accepted there, in contrast to England, where such freedom was far more limited. The English had already experienced assertive female power in the form of Henry II's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Edward II's wife, Isabella, and had reacted with little enthusiasm. During Henry VI's reign, a trio of politically ambitious women from the continent confronted a weak king. Henry's own mother, Catherine of Valois, had married Owen Tudor without royal consent, while Jacquetta of Luxembourg married Richard Woodville in a similar breach of protocol. Margaret of Anjou sought to rule directly in place of her incapacitated husband. When she failed to secure authority for herself, she used her young son as a political tool, aligning with powerful allies like Edmund Beaufort to further her influence. Jacquetta's defiance resulted in only a fine, and Henry VI even elevated Woodville to Earl Rivers. Catherine of Valois' marriage to the founder of the Tudor dynasty also endured without major repercussions. Margaret of Anjou, meanwhile, was allowed considerable leeway as long as her husband remained the official head of the government. These bold women became easy targets for demonization by their enemies. Henry's opponents pointed to the prominence of these women at court as evidence of his declining royal authority, particularly when compared to traditional English political culture. Cecily Neville sought to avoid these pitfalls. While she was politically active, she consistently stood behind her husband, Richard of York, and refrained from stepping into the spotlight herself. Around 1454, she interceded with Queen Margaret on Richard's behalf, and in November 1459, she travelled to London to advocate for him in Parliament. Cecily's loyalty paid off. She enjoyed a high reputation, and when she and her younger children were captured by Lancastrian forces, they were allowed to stay with her sister, demonstrating the respect she commanded. In this era, 3 distinct female roles of power emerged, embodied by these prominent women. 1. Cecily, the faithful wife and protective mother. 2. Margaret of Anjou, the power-driven fighter who also played the role of mother. 3. Jacquetta, who enjoyed a comparatively great degree of freedom due to her status. In the Wars of the Roses, it's hardly surprising that the English gravitated toward the side that aligned with their political traditions and Cecily was central to this alignment. Throughout her life, Cecily Neville struggled to balance her personal relationship with Margaret of Anjou against the realities of their public roles. Fate had made them political opponents despite a mutual liking and respect. The two women shared common ground, and their lives even ended on similar notes. Margaret, after risking everything and losing it all, spent her final years in seclusion and religious devotion in France. Cecily respected this choice and the personal sacrifices it represented. Jacquetta of Luxembourg, however, was a different matter entirely. In Cecily's eyes, Jacquetta represented disorder. She had defied social norms by marrying beneath her status, incurring only a £1,000 fine for doing so. And unlike Margaret, Jacquetta's actions weren't motivated by a noble cause. She simply sought to satisfy her own desires. Cecily found herself following Jacquetta's path again and again. A few years after the death of the Duke of Bedford, Cecily's husband, Richard, took command in France, where stories about Jacquetta's free-spirited nature circulated. Her first marriage had produced no children. Likely due to Bedford's infertility, he had also been childless in his first marriage. But Jacquetta later had 14 children in her second marriage, even more than Cecily, proving her fertility was never in question. To contemporaries, Jacquetta's actions seemed opportunistic. She had fulfilled her obligations during her first marriage, inherited a third of Bedford's vast fortune as a widow, and then followed her own inclinations with little regard for societal expectations. Furthermore, through her marriage, Jacquetta became related to the Queen, securing her position at court further. In contrast, Cecily and Richard had to fight for everything. Richard's appointment as commander in France came only through the intervention of Cecily's uncle, Cardinal Beaufort, who referred to Richard as "my very dear and most beloved nephew," symbolically embracing him into the family. Skepticism about Richard stemmed from the lingering suspicion of treachery surrounding his ancestors. But to Cecily, this distrust was unwarranted. Richard had been raised under loyal Lancastrian guardianship and had always served faithfully. Jacquetta, on the other hand, had openly defied a royal order and received nothing more than a fine, easily covered by her inheritance. It's clear Cecily was far from pleased when her son, King Edward IV, married Jacquetta's daughter, Elizabeth Woodville. In Cecily's view, Elizabeth had been raised under her mother's chaotic, self-serving ideals, and now that disorder had infiltrated her own family. One striking detail is the name of Cecily and Richard's first child. They named their daughter Anne, almost certainly after Richard's mother, Anne Mortimer. However, it is also the name of Bedford's first wife, a daughter of the Duke of Burgundy. Realistically, this likely had no bearing on the choice, but I like to think that Cecily may have subtly expressed her displeasure with Jacquetta through this choice as well. What we know for certain is that Cecily saw herself as a potential key to peace. As a member of the Lancaster line married to the leading York representative, she could serve as a symbolic figure to unite the hostile houses. This role went beyond her intercessions on behalf of her husband or later efforts to convince her son George to reconcile with Edward. Cecily also aimed to act as a bridge for Lancaster supporters during Edward's reign. Notably, she spent her first Christmas and New Year under her son's kingship, not with her family, but alone at Eltham. This aligned with societal expectations for a recent widow, but it also created an opportunity for those wishing to approach the new royal family without facing it directly. Her diplomatic intent is also reflected in one of Cecily's most famous depictions, found in the Neville Book of Hours. In this image, the colors white and red, the symbols of the rival houses, are prominently displayed. These colors appear on her headgear, subtly suggesting unity. What would later become the Tudor rose brought to life by Cecily's granddaughter Elizabeth of York, can be seen here in its early form. This image dates from before the Wars of the Roses had fully erupted, showing how significant Cecily's connections were, even in the public perception of that time. Even the coat of arms of her paternal family used these colors intensively. It was no coincidence that Ralph Neville had been entrusted with the guardianship of the York heir. Unfortunately, no contemporary colored portrait of Jacquetta exists for comparison. An often circulated image purportedly showing her in Lancaster red is, in fact, not of Jacquetta, but of an unknown woman from Burgundy. Later depictions mistakenly based on this image have created inconsistency in her visual legacy. Let's return to the topic. The consequences of the rivalry between Jacquetta of Luxembourg and Cecily Neville during the Wars of the Roses are evident. Initially, on opposite sides, their competition became yet another driving force in the conflict. When circumstances forced them onto the same side, their rivalry created a deep rift within the royal family. We don't know whether, or to what extent, Cecily was aware of her nephew Richard Neville's and her son George's plans in 1469. Historical fiction often speculates that she might have been a co-conspirator, but I don't believe this to be the case. However, Cecily played no particularly active role during this time. We know of 2 mediation attempts between Edward and George, but that's all. From Cecily's perspective, Jacquetta's chaos seemed to have infiltrated her family. Once Elizabeth Woodville became queen, the problems began. Richard Neville, the kingmaker, felt sidelined. George, heir to the throne until 1470, felt underappreciated, and the high nobility resented being compelled to marry into the Woodville family. Cecily, loyal to her self-image, did not openly oppose these developments, but she also did not support them. In 1460, she symbolically shielded her children in a marketplace before Lancaster's troops, but during these events, she remained on the sidelines. During Edward's second reign, Cecily developed a close relationship with one of her son's wives, but it wasn't the Queen. Instead, it was Anne Neville, Richard's wife, and Cecily's great-niece. Jacquetta's death in 1472 could have been an opportunity to mend the relationship with Queen Elizabeth, but that reconciliation never happened. In my interpretation, Cecily blamed the Woodvilles for the turmoil and distanced herself. I'm not the biggest fan of historical comparisons, as history doesn't unfold in a controlled environment, but in this case, a comparison is revealing. 20 years later, a similar dynamic arose between Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York. Like Cecily and Jacquetta, they came from opposing factions. Margaret had allied herself with Elizabeth's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, though she never fully trusted her. Plans were also made to marry many Yorkist members into the nobility, much like the Woodvilles. This time, however, the alliance worked. Several factors contributed to this. Elizabeth of York embraced a traditional role as queen, refraining from following her mother's example. Margaret Beaufort, meanwhile, wielded her influence as Queen Dowager with more authority than her predecessors, but she remained within the traditional boundaries of her role. She understood that her family's future depended on the success of her son's marriage. While there are hints that Margaret and Elizabeth of York may not have liked each other, Margaret never stepped aside when her son or his family was threatened. The Tudor dynasty weathered its early storms and stabilized, while the House of York fell into repeated internal crises, with its members turning against one another, ultimately leading to its downfall. The rivalry between Cecily and Jacquetta offers crucial insight into how this unraveling occurred. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe to help the channel.